Hello, welcome to another Music Ally Focus with me, Music Ally's editor, Joe Sparrow. Now, we're a long way removed from music magazines and even maybe music blogs. So what does a music publication need to be in 2023? We talk a lot on the podcast about marketing from the artist side. That's getting projects to launch and connecting them to as many people as possible. But what about the point after that? When the music fans debate and discuss music and explore and discover music that they don't know that they don't yet know. Sean Adams of Drowned in Sound explains how he's going to build a modern music publication. Now, this Focus podcast, as you know, like Music Ally, provides an analysis-rich and contextual guide to the music business, and each episode analyses one meaningful thing at a time. And it should be fairly quick, although not quite as quick as normal, because Sean and I, who have known each other for a while, prattled on a little bit longer than planned. However, it should take about the same amount of time as, entirely hypothetically of course, Patrick Bertoletti could eat 7.5 kilos of shrimp. Patrick ate 167 grams in 1 minute in 2012. Now, with that slightly nautical theme in mind, Drowned in Sound was founded by Sean Adams as one of the UK's earliest music blogs back in the year 2000. And then it became one of the UK's leading music publications, growing into a successful record label, an early podcast, and things like live shows along the way. Drowned in Sound had to duck and dive with the shifting media economy along the way, and having paused Drowned in Sound for a few years now, Adams is bringing the publication back. But he figures it needs to be in a format that connects with the needs of music fans in a 2023 environment. So, what is the mix of content, platforms, and community stuff that music fans need now if they want a jumping off point that is more contextual and community driven than a simple playlist? We asked Sean to explain his plans. Sean Adams, welcome to the podcast, and thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Now, for you listeners out there, Sean and I go back a little way. Sean is one of the, I don't want to use the phrase OG, because that makes me sound a lot more street than I am, but
I've used it a few times sarcastically.
Okay, good. Well, then, in that context, sarcastically, you are one of the OGs of music blogging, and that's how Sean and I met a frighteningly long time ago when I was running a blog as well. And of course, Sean, to put our blogs alongside each other is a little bit of a disservice, because Drowned in Sound became the big UK blog, and then a huge platform on top of that, and all sorts of related things. Can you? We're talking at the moment about this sort of I want to say the glorious rebirth of Drowned in Sound, but albeit in a modern context. But for that wider context, can you explain to our listeners what the background of Drowned in Sound was and the journey of it in the sort of music and media landscape and your part in that?
So Drowned in Sound started in the year 2000. For a couple of years before that, I was doing an email fanzine, I called it, which was called The Last Resort, which I did alongside my GCSEs, which is the perfect time to run a fanzine, but confused people because everyone else was stapled and mine was sent out by email. And so Drowned in Sound there was a couple of reasons why it started then. There was a lot of people asking to write for the Drowned in Sound, the email fanzine. And one of them was like Matt Johnson, who now manages Sugar Babes, and there was a whole bunch of people involved at the time, and it had grown from this thing where I reviewed Muse's demo in one of the early issues of my email to the artists we were writing about were getting bigger. There was lots of Idlewild and Arab Strap and kind of stuff that would get played on the evening session. And I was obviously quite active on lots of forums around the web, but I didn't really like the doctrine of here's a music forum about Radiohead, therefore the discussion kind of, if you talk about a band that Radiohead fans don't like, everything kind of sits in a different space.
Not that Radiohead fans are extremely opinionated or anything.
That's just an example. There were lots of other forums where I felt like you had to be part of the kind of almost religion, and I wanted somewhere where you could just be a music fan. I'd grown up reading the music press, religiously read Melody Maker, Vox, Select. I loved lots of the skate and surf magazines, which often have really great music coverage, and the soundtracks to all those things were really turned me on to a lot of very political punk music from quite a young age. So I'd been aware of independent culture and DIY movements, and so Drowned in Sound was sort of a symptom of that wanting to create a forum and wanting to create a platform online. Because obviously stuff in an email, like it was a bit easier to start publishing in 2000. And then very quickly, the artists we were championing weren't getting signed. We were putting on shows. A&R people were coming down, all those kind of things. And so then the label started off the back of, there was like a band called the Koreans that I absolutely fell in love with. They have two brilliant lead singers and great melodic songs. And I put a single out and we sold 2,000 CD singles, which dates how much you could sell in 2003. And the Kaiser Chiefs, Bat for Lashes, Metric, various artists followed quite quickly afterwards. And the website itself had quite a simple editorial platform. There was no sub-editing or even approval before anything went up for like the first 4 years or so, which was quite chaotic sometimes. There was a speaking of Radiohead, there was like a 4 out of 10 review of Kid A, which went down in internet history in some circles for being very much against the grain of what everyone else was saying about Kid A. It was written by someone that missed the guitars. I'm not sure whether I'm proud that we did that or not, but it is what it is. There's lots of my favorite records actually over the years have got bad reviews. Like there's a Panic at a Disco review up there, and I'm like, this is one of the best records of the 21st century, and it's got this bad review on my own website.
It's just one person's review, isn't it?
I mean, exactly.
But in the internet era, it because it then gets aggregated somewhere, it then becomes a big deal, doesn't it?
And I saw it as a blogging platform, but people didn't really understand what that meant. I quite liked the idea that 5 people could review the same album, but we never really fell into that, often just because you couldn't hear the record before it was out. Like one person would get a link to it or something. So Drowning Sound grew. We started a podcast in 2005. We got an advance on our ad money and launched The Quietus in 2008. And then the financial crash hit. Everything went upside down. I made everyone redundant. Then went back to just doing it as a kind of bit more of a DIY project for a few years. Started managing artists. Started writing for the Sunday Times. Went to work for the BBC for a bit. And I've been doing artist management kind of alongside freelance things for the last few years. So, and in all amongst all of that, I've always like adapted to whatever the platform of the time was. So like when MySpace was big, we started a top 8 column on the site where we would find an artist we like and then jump through their top 8 and find 8 artists to recommend. Or when Spotify took off, I was writing for their like blog, because there was no playlists on Spotify itself. You had to go to their blog to find the playlists, and it was like me and a couple of other people posting in their official blogs.
That's a very 2008 state of affairs, isn't it? No playlist, but you can find it on the blog. I mean, what you've just described there is sort of encapsulates that journey that the music industry's come since 2000 as well, which is 1999, introduction to broadband, collapse of the traditional recorded music industry, and then the recalibration to what it is now.
Collapse. I want to question you on that one. The biggest time for CD sales was 2001.
Right. The beginning of the collapse.
But there was a death rattle that was huge and very lucrative for a lot of people.
Yes, well, the wheel can keep spinning when the hamster's died. Like that can sometimes happen. But you're right. But you've sort of tracked that change there, and the consumption of not only music but all the ancillary things around it as well is kind of quite clear there, going from email to blogs to sort of organized blog. Then the impact of the financial crisis and things like that back then.
I thought you said from emo, as if emo's gone away. You said emo.
No, that's having a resurgence. That's back, baby. So with all those different perspectives and having written out all those different things in different ways, what does it mean to, I don't mean this in like a psychological sense, but what does it mean to relaunch a music publication like Drowned in Sound in 2023? What can it be now? What should it be now?
Well, this is the question I've been asking myself. If I was 17 again, not the Zach Braff movie, but literally if I was in that mindset, what would I be doing? Because I think that overly enthusiastic music fan hasn't really left me. And trying to work out what I would want to read, but also what I'd want to create is quite interesting. Like, I think in one way, I could become a YouTuber, but I'm not sure I'm quite the right person to suddenly decide that's my career pivot. I could start a journal in print and do something amazing like Gold Flake Paint does, and I think like that was something that I looked at a bit. I think seeing what Pitchforks magazine did was really interesting, and I love print, and like I've spent a fair bit of time looking at that for a few years. I think the idea of relaunching, I think it's actually a bit more about reconnecting, which I know it sounds like a pedantic difference, but I think that there's people out there that have been quite happy with Discover Weekly, with some of the media publications that they've got in their media diet. But we're seeing this big shift, and the shift, having been on the kind of record releasing side of things, is there's not really staffs at a lot of publications now, so there's not people to listen to things and process what's coming in. If they do write about you, then it's kind of down you to take your audience to publication sometimes, rather than an audience that like desperately reading everything that goes up on a website to try and find something new to listen to. And I think we're seeing this kind of, the creator economy has kind of become everything. So like music's now expected to be part of it. Journalism is now supposed to be part of it. Like all the political journalists that jump to Substack, and like you're starting to see all these different shifts. And there's companies like Tortoise Media doing like amazing investigative journalism, and that's running in audio formats. And I spend most of my time listening to podcasts, and it seems silly to me that when we did a podcast in 2005, that I didn't join the dots between, I love interviewing artists, I love creating space to do things like we did a crib special that really stuck with me because they came into the office, we set up some mics, and they talked us through the outsider music that changed their life. And I got introduced to Daniel Johnston and all sorts of things that I probably should have been familiar with, but had read about but never listened to or had not come across. And I hated transcribing. So why was I running a website where part of my job was to sit and transcribe an interview when actually it was the interview itself which I found enjoyable? So I should have realized in 2005 to stick with what we were doing. We only stopped because music licensing was too complicated. We thought we were going to get like a hospital radio license rather than paying more than Spotify pay now because we were essentially allowing people to download the music rather than just stream it. So all of those things are complicated, but I guess in terms of what it means to relaunch something, I'm aware that like artists reform and restart their careers, and I've jokingly said it's a bit like when we closed down, it's a bit like LCD Sound System playing Madison Square Garden. We probably got more coverage for announcing we were closing than we'd had in like 10 years. But that wasn't the point. It become untenable. The ad revenue couldn't justify paying like the couple of people that were on small retainers to keep everything ticking over. So I think that I'm quite excited that I can now kind of relook at what it is. And it's probably going to be in a bit of a weird place for a bit, feeling a bit like Roger Waters' Pink Floyd, because there's been different editors of Drowned in Sound over the years and different eras of it. But I've been pretty consistent in keeping the recommendation side of it going, keeping the like social channels ticking over and stuff. So I don't think it's going to be a massive shock to anyone what it's aimed to be.
You mentioned earlier how you used to sort of obsessively read the Melody Maker, Vox, and Select back in. This is aging us to the 90s, folks. And those were the three that I religiously read as well at that time. And I used to read Melody Maker to get obviously news, because it was the Melody Maker for our American listeners. The Melody Maker was the other weekly music print newspaper along with the NME, and obviously I'd read it to get news, but also the context around the music and learn about music that I couldn't access from the radio, which was the only or the record shops. Obviously, the whole landscape has changed. Then blogging came and went to an extent. What does the public want now as a starting point? They don't want they want some of those things, but in different ways. But they what is the equivalent of that? I would go and buy the Melody Maker to get those things. What do they want today? What are the angles and perspectives and content that they want in today's consumption world? the music
I
consumption?
I think at some points, obviously, before you could stream things, media was like a kind of consumer guide in some respects for some people. It was what's the interesting band to buy a ticket by or buy an album by. Um, and I mean, obviously, with you do most research, if you ask the audience what they want, you'll get a load of confusing answers. And I don't want to assume that I know what people want, but I think I've got a fair idea of, from an artist point of view, what's needed out there. Like, I think a lot of the editorial that you do on this podcast is fascinating to me from someone that works in the industry point of view, but some of it is maybe complex if you're an artist, one of the 100,000 artists a week trying to get their music's heard on streaming platforms and cut through on. And if you're a music fan that doesn't understand why hoodies have gone up by £20 at Brixton Academy, or any other venue where the venues are taking a large cut of the merch money, to be able to understand and appreciate those kind of things, I think is really important. But also, it's like AI and music. What's the exciting bit of it for fans and musicians? What's the bit where, like, you put the question to an artist that's got a really great insight? For instance, I keep thinking like about what the podcast side of what we're going to be doing going forward will be like, and I keep coming back to the interview I did with this artist called EMA. She's not one of the best known artists around. She's opened for Depeche Mode on tour. She's made 3 incredible records, and one of those artists that people discovered through our site. And I interviewed her at a virtual reality Barbican installation that she'd soundtracked. And everything we talked about for like an hour was fascinating. She was thinking about the future and where things might head. And there are artists that if you give them the right questions and the right space to talk, they can really illuminate ideas that may lead you to go and listen to their music or going and buying a ticket. But actually, I think there are some extraordinary minds in music, and there's 30-second TikTok clip is not going to do that justice, or a 5-minute radio interview where they're quite nervous or are after going to be talked about their new single, which doesn't actually give them the breadth and depth to talk about all the other things.
So what is the mix that you've landed on? If you're re-emerging or getting the band back together, what's the mix?
So the first part of it, going back to those magazines, is how important cover mounts were to me. And compilation albums gave me my music taste. Like, there's something about the curation that was part of the process, which really just introduced me to things. Obviously, it just was at a point pre-streaming. And so the record label I'm looking at the moment, the first project is a 10-track compilation with 1 track released each month, with an interview with the artist on the podcast, kind of putting their music into context. So the first release is on February 7th by Faith Fern, who was in a band called Pins, who some people might know because they worked with Iggy Pop. She's also done a collaboration with Maxine Peake. They've released 3 brilliant albums. I might have got that number wrong. And like, I've always been a big Pins fan, and she told me she was working on solo stuff. I was like, oh, I'm working on this thing. Would you like to do a first single with me? So, but we're working on like content that fits around the release, some of which fits in with what Drowning Sound does, but some of it actually just amplifies the release. So there's that side of it. And to know that in the podcast feed, you might not have come for the singles club, but what you might do is come in for an interview with a major artist or someone discussing a big idea and then discover one of the acts. So I've always been quite keen on, like, I know lots of music blogs were great because they covered loads of new artists, but I always like to get the balance right of things you're familiar with to introduce you to things that you're not. So I think there's definitely something in the mix of interviews and conversations and documentaries and maybe longer form audio pieces, multi-part audio pieces. Like, I'm really interested in the science of sound and looking at how sound impacts the body and the mind much more than music. So there's a sound therapist that I'm talking to. We're actually going to do a whole series of conversations looking at different ideas around that, which, wouldn't that be amazing if someone learns about a frequency which then goes into records? and someone makes a beautiful kind of afternoon meditation piece of ambient music off the back of listening to something we've done. And so like I really like the kind of literary kind of essay style of journalism, and the kind of quite immersive first person style of journalism. And I also just like chatting to someone and getting a better sense of who they are off the back of an interview. So I'm hoping I can bring those worlds and thoughts and ideas together, and actually putting ideas to the fore much more than campaigns and new releases. So does that make sense?
Yes, but I mean, it feels like what you're describing there is actually, there's a lot of alignment with what a lot of artists are trying to do. I'm trying to avoid reducing this down to something as glib as saying, well, it's like building a community, isn't it? Artists are doing this right at the moment as well. They're identifying what works for them individually and they enjoy, what their fans enjoy, and finding all those paths to them, which may have nothing to do with music, or maybe very sort of loosely connected in some ways, and then bringing it all together, and you're building a place where people feel refuge. Drown in Sound, in its sort of previous incarnation, was a huge component of that was the forums that ran alongside it, and
which are still doing 3 million page views a month, which is
still there. People are still active, and is home to a lot of, let's say, very robust review opinions on things. There's something there, isn't there, about the needs of people today and what they're looking for. We're talking about things which are not necessarily new ideas, but they're fitting together in a unique mix.
Yeah, I think you're touching on the signal to noise thing that I think about a lot of. There's so much around. How do you focus people's attention? And like the thing I loved about magazines is you can turn the page from the cover feature to something smaller. And the big thing where my head's at the moment is just thinking about how do you bring an artist into the world. Like I learned so much working at Six Music on the social channels around topics people want to discuss and talk about and think about and be distracted by briefly, and how to work with an artist on something when they come in to promote the radio special they might have recorded. Or like I was so lucky, I got so many fun little opportunities, like backstage at some of the festivals in Liverpool. I got everyone that came through for interviews to tell me what song they would put on the Best of the Beatles, knowing that the new Alan Partridge series was dropping in a few weeks' time. And we would have all these artists in Liverpool talking about the Beatles song they like. And it seemed silly to everyone that came in. But when you've got John Grant talking about the song Alan Partridge would like, followed by the one he would put on there himself, it was just silly and fun. But then I'd do things like St. Vincent came in and I got her to talk through the 6 riffs that changed her life. And to sit a couple of meters from St. Vincent shredding Tool and Hendrix and things was just, and to capture it and to be able to share that online. So to really think about with an artist, what's the thing about them that's of interest to their existing fans, but also new fans, and to really unlock that a bit. Because I like, as you were saying, it's like artists are expected to be content creators, and like that's the C word that I don't normally say, so I apologize for using it. But thinking about how they connect and how you build that community, and how, like, Adam Buxton's podcast has got an amazing community. I've never met any of them, and we probably would only meet if he puts on a show, but I know that I'm part of something when I listen to it, as he walks his dog in the rain. And like, you know that you're listening to something and feel like you're like the other people. Like, you used to get that reading magazines, you felt like I'm part of something, even if like you might spot someone with it under their arm one day, and that's about as close as you get to being part of something.
And again, that idea of community is, it then sort of in the modern realm brings you on to, okay, so how are you going to again, we're using buzzwords here, Sean, we're all friends here, how are you going to monetize that? I interviewed a while ago on this podcast the UK metalcore band While She Sleeps, and one of their super fans, and this super fan was paying I think 55 or 60
I listened to that episode.
A month. Thank you, Sean, I appreciate that. And what was really striking to me was that he was really not just happy to be paying this money, it really gave him so much pleasure to be paying quite a substantial amount of money to his favourite band every month, but not just because it gave him things in return, like exclusive gigs and meeting the band and that kind of thing, which is great if you're a super fan, but he really felt part of it. That meant so much to him that he was contributing to the growth and this continued success of this band, and he felt part of that. So this isn't about sort of just like the sort of very basic idea of, okay, you've captured all these people, now let's eke a little bit of money out of them. But it's more about how for something like this, which is a sort of media platform, it's that part of the music industry we're not forgotten about, but we talk a lot about the marketing and the releasing, and then it's out there. And actually, you've got this whole second wave of, okay, people geeking out and talking about it and discussing it. And how do you, in the modern world, make a sort of an economy around that?
Well, I think it's the curator's dilemma, which is the same thing that publishers are going through. And I have no idea whether the curator's dilemma is a real thing. I just put two words together and put dilemma. Always seems to be
I'm willing to buy into
a way of, like, I'm sure there would be a Atlantic think piece with like 4 million views that I've probably read about 10 years ago and forgotten about. But if you're the record company, or if you're the playlist maker, or if you're like, it's difficult to get at the level that, say, a radio presenter salary would be for being invited in for your curation skills, or a music supervisor who's employed to kind of. So I'm thinking a lot about, do people value that? Which bit do they value? Do they quite like the fact that there's a couple of things that overlap? So I've spent a lot of time thinking about fan clubs over the last few years, and especially for some of the consultancy work I've been doing, but actually thinking really deeply about, do you want to be one of 300 people supporting a Patreon? Or actually, if there's 10 artists you like, would you rather be part of a club that's helping support 10 artists that you like, and maybe only 2 of them you're familiar with? And like, would you then be introduced to some new favorite bands if you put your trust in someone? So I got quite deep into an idea around late 2000s of, there was quite a few, there was like My Major Company and Band Stocks, and the idea of like a fan funded record label really made sense to me. And I'm still at the edges of figuring out if that's where I'm headed, but it's like music magazines, like we've just talked very warmly about Melody Maker, and it's like, I probably had a subscription, but I don't think my subscription was like an altruistic contribution. It was to make sure I got the actual physical thing. So as we've shifted into this kind of much more ethereal digital world, trying to work out how you place a value on that, because like some of the projects I'm looking at doing over the next few months, I'm actually like not it started off as a kind of half joke to myself, but like, what would music curation look like in a gallery? Like if you actually created visuals that were pieces of art, like there's loads of amazing like data art I've seen recently, and like I'm fascinated by the idea of, could I commission something like that? And then you can like, I love the idea of creating a like workspace where we've picked the music or worked on the music in there, and you pay an entry fee like you would for a gig, but to sit somewhere with beautiful art and music, and like, which I know sounds like a huge step away from going to a concert at the O2 or so I'm thinking about all those different things to think, what happens in a venue on a daytime on a Tuesday afternoon, and could we find a way that overlaps with the kind of music curation that we've been known for? And like, then like, is there something, I don't know, I'm like,
it's the Slack economy of venues, the daytime. Yeah.
I mean, as I'm saying this, all I can picture is Jared Leto in that WeWork documentary, and thinking, that's not what I'm saying.
But this is a fundamental question, isn't it? Because as the music industry has shifted, the recorded music industry has shifted so dramatically as well. Our starting point has shifted dramatically to the point where, you're talking about trust, and you're talking about this idea of curation is kind of, it's true, but it's also kind of funny, because it's this is why people tune into radio shows and have done for so many years. You've mentioned there, for instance, clustering different types of output, and idea, concepts, podcasts, experiences around this thing. We've skirted around, I think, heroically around Web3 and DAOs so far. But of course,
you can't hear that, but I made a very big upside down smile then.
If you did hear any grinding noise, that was Sean's teeth. The basic idea of a DAO, for instance, is that it is a hyper fan club that is, blockchainified, but ultimately a fan club is a fan club, right? The Beatles had them, they worked.
Yeah.
The Monkees had them when they worked, it's fine. So how do you have to sort of spin it for that, the crowd you're aiming at, which is the consumer that needs to put faith in something in order to get something back?
Well, I think people currently have got a deeper connection to artists than the people behind them, which makes perfect sense. Like, I'm really curious to experiment with like Bandcamp subscription model, where you can actually drop PDFs in there and voice notes and all sorts of other things, which then becomes a bit more like a publication. In fact, there was a magazine years ago, I don't know if you remember that guy Dave from Rockblog. I've forgotten what the project was he launched, but it was like crowd-funded, Bandcamp-led kind of like magazine that you bought from Bandcamp, which I thought was just like a really nice format. And like I hadn't actually thought about how that's gone into my subconscious as something that I was really inspired by. But like, advertisers don't necessarily value what it is that you're putting out in the current models. They value the scale of people they can reach. And I think a lot about who values music and who values journalism, editorial criticism, curation, whichever of those three things you want to talk about. And obviously, we've moved into a world where a lot of things are paywalled, but we're also in an attention economy where you put the most impactful thing out for free in hope of getting scale. So trying to work out how to ride both of those horses of doing something of quality that's valuable, but also that enough people are aware of, because you can create scale. Like, it's an interesting challenge for both artists and publications. And I had a reasonably good hit rate with the label first time round of finding things which grew. And like, I remember we put a Blood Red Shoes single out, and Drowning Sound must have got mentioned on the radio like 5 times in a week because the single was getting airplay. And I don't know how many people discovered us through that, but it felt like the perfect overlap of, here's a band we love and believe in that we've released, and here are some people hearing the name of us that might end up reading what we're doing. So I'm like, you talked about it as a relaunch, and I think it's like I've just like pressed play again after pressing pause. So I'm thinking quite a lot about the possibility of all these things, and like, I don't want to deluge with like all the different things I'm thinking about, but I think that there's a lot of space that's opened up over, especially the last few years. Like, Patreon as a concept doesn't seem as odd as it did. You load up a Twitch stream and people are gifting subscriptions to people. Like, but you can also, if you've got Amazon Prime, get a free month that you give to the person that you're following. And like, so just looking at some of the ways in which brands could potentially pay it forward to offer the premium stuff to people that can't afford it, and like looking at the ways in which companies with some quite big ambitious targets of how many people they want to reach, but also aren't content creators that might be interested in something that overlaps, that sits with their plan. So I'm looking at a lot of those different things at the moment, but I really, truly, the one thing I want to create is a space where artists feel confident, comfortable, and welcome to express themselves, because I think there's so many places online at the moment where the interview is either very focused, or it's a bit like, can we get a news line out of this, because of the clicks and the kind of the way in which news economics is now based on how much attention you can drive to a story. And those are things that I'm kind of very conscious of them not leaning into that.
And do you think that audiences are sort of increasingly aware of that? Because I've spoken about this a lot on the podcast, but one of the most remarkable things of the last 5 years is the way that fan bases are motivated to do things based on the artist talking about. For instance, Taylor Swift is the example I always cite, which is she tells her fans, it's not fair that I don't own the masters to my recordings, and I would like to own the masters to my recordings. And so her fans are then hyper motivated to vote with their feet and only play the new versions she's put out, which devalues, or potentially could devalue, the original recordings over time. Now that's just wild, because like, why should any fan care about the the sort of copyright issues around recordings and ownership, but now they do, and then they do things as a consequence of that. So is that part of it in terms of when you talk about consumption of music, discussion of music, context and curatorial, editorial discussion? Is that something as well that those group of people are interested in?
I think so. And I think what you're actually talking about is something that's about music appreciation, but not necessarily of the notes and the melodies and the lyrics, but it's actually the appreciation of the human behind it. Like, I think the conversations around mental health in music have been really important. The conversations around inequality and the environment and various other topics, which often, for instance, I started a thread on Twitter this morning, and the amount of people questioning vinyl's environmental footprint is something which doesn't really get talked about. But then people are like, well, how bad is streaming? It must be really bad because of all these servers. And it's like, well, actually, there's not enough data out there, because the people that could tell you, it's not really in their best interest to talk about the impact of the energy they use and how renewable they are or aren't. So these are all things which, as a fan, if you can't comprehend the importance of them, can you comprehend the value of something? And as a consumer, I often feel that I don't understand the true value. Like, for instance, paying for Twitter Blue at the moment, like, it's an odd thing to give Elon Musk your money. I mean, his finances are in free fall, and he's probably going to need it soon. But that idea that you're not altruistically contributing to a platform or to an individual behind it because of the way it's being run, and I think those are all huge things to consider when what you might spend your £11 on. Like, for instance, I subscribe to Mubi, which I absolutely love for its curation of movies. It's 30 films at a time, a new one every day, and they're available for 30 days. So it's kind of a consistent, and I would love to make something like that for music, but I often keep my subscription going when I haven't watched it for a few months, because I love the fact that they're involved in supporting independent cinema above everything else. And I think those things are really important. Like, you can read on the back of a cup of coffee, on a kind of bag of coffee, whereabouts it's come from, how it's been sourced. Like, I loved reading about Lika Lee's mezcal, which is one, delicious, but two, is supporting a kind of bit of a business in a country where there aren't loads of female-led businesses. Like, she's found this amazing kind of independent way of kind of bringing, and like, I don't know how much of that story like is part of the reason why when I was drinking it, I was able to join dots. But I think we're all very conscious of this, like, living in a world of storytelling. But often those kind of non-fiction-y, marketing-y type stories are important, because you've got a decision of how you spend your time and your money.
Well, it's
so it's like how ethically you spend that time and money is really important.
Yeah, and it's a sort of conflation of some of the things which are really becoming a lot more apparently meaningful, which is contextual information to, like you say, like, you could be drinking something and it's just a good drink, or you could be drinking something and it's suddenly a really, really meaningful drink and you're really enjoying it. But it's a contextual information. It's also authenticity, which is sort of one of those really complicated things in the modern landscape, because everybody needs and wants to be authentic, but then they also want to game the system and that's when you go into marketing and inauthenticity. So that's a really hard thing to straddle, isn't it, as well? And then at the same time, the thing we're really coming back to here is sort of making order out of the chaos and saying, okay, yeah, you want to be part of this, then you have to sort of exclude these things, but the experience is richer. And actually, that does come when you boil that down to music. Again, let's go back to our blogging background. That was all about, or the traditional sort of music blogging thing was saying, right, here's 250 words on this song, this artist, here it is. It adds the context around the song. You click play on the Bandcamp stream and listen to it. But then we very, very quickly transitioned across to the playlist driven sort of version of that, which is, well, now my brand is I'm a playlist, and here's 100 songs, and next week I'll switch out 20 for 20 and you can listen to that. And it becomes then about sort of being first to hear the new thing, to be able to tell other people you've heard this thing first, and it's sort of it becomes something different to context. It's very fast moving.
Well, the context is only the things that sit alongside each other. You often don't know the interlinks between songs on a playlist together, or the depths, or the fact that like one song is all made in the box and it's synthetic instruments, and the others all perform live and recorded in an expensive studio. Like all of those, like, and not those things make a difference to how it emotionally impacts you, but the value of the extra thing that you add to it is really important.
And that also sits at odds with the 100,000 new songs per day stats, which we can question another time. But like, let's face it, there's a huge volume being created, and this sort of sits at counter to one main approach, which is, right, we've got to filter out the best stuff from that fastest and get it out there to get it in front of people. Well, there's also another argument of saying, well, what if we don't? What if you listen to this song 2 weeks after it comes out? Is that a big deal? And then what else can you provide around it? So do you think, I guess what I'm trying to get at is, do you think there is like an underrepresented or underfulfilled audience of people who perhaps are hankering after something that they don't know what it is yet, and perhaps to an extent you and I don't really know what it is yet, but you're getting towards it?
Yeah, I often think about watching music at festivals, and you're walking around, and like I used to love just like skimming through the program or searching up, like often when I've got a gap in like a festival schedule and I'm like, well, there's 5 acts and I've never heard of any of them like to choose from, and I look up a little bit about them all, and the fact that you can do that is really important.
Yeah.
But the fact that you can't easily do that always bugs me a bit. Like I remember going back to skate videos, like they used to put on the screen who the music was by. And it was so key for me to become familiar with names of artists. And like I'd remember, I really liked that song, and then you'd be in a record shop and you'd look up the record. And that was a small amount of information, and now people use Shazam to do that. But the fact that songs on adverts on TV don't have it, like I'd imagine some artists would take half the sync fee to have their music there on screen and their name so that people know to go look them up. Because the amount of money that's spent in marketing to join the dots between, hey, you know that beautiful song you liked on this advert, here it is to buy on CD. And I think like looking at context as, like I've been talking a fair bit with Yancey, who was one of the co-founders of Kickstarter and his meta label project, which I'm really intrigued by. And like I've learned a lot. I went to their summer school with like Extinction Rebellion and Holly Herndon and people doing guest speeches, and I think there's something really in the thing that he talks about a lot, which is high context, which is, if you imagine Discogs, Wikipedia, a magazine article, everything else sitting around something when you're consuming it or listening to it or first discovering it, or like if the difference between shopping on the Ocado website and in the Deliveroo app is massive, because on one you can see the allergens and learn a bit more about the product, and that's on like so I realize this is quite a middle class example, but if you buy shopping on Ocado, there's no allergy information, and almost always it says click here to go through to find out, and it's a hyperlink it's not clickable, which is obviously a bugbear for someone that knows how databases and technology all joins together. But that idea of context is so important, and I have spent the last few years quite concerned about the lack of that, like writing copy for social media posts around like Glastonbury, for instance. You want to give a bit of enthusiasm and a little bit of context, because if you want someone to go spend an hour watching Lizzo's Glastonbury set, and obviously everyone should go spend an hour watching Lizzo's Glastonbury set because it was incredible, figuring out what are those intriguing few words is very different than figuring out what the 25 paragraphs, how to get your editor to commission that piece for a kind of long form. I've had a lot of fun doing social media things, and probably the most ridiculous of which was review the Foo Fighters in emojis, which I did during Glastonbury. And Danny Baker got very upset about the end of music journalism because people were just using emojis to review music.
Wow.
But it was really intriguing and telling the way in which people reacted and responded and used the modern ways of speaking.
But when does all this happen then? When does this unpausing start?
So I've put up a little trailer for the podcast already, so people can subscribe on Apple and Spotify, and I'm sure there'll be a link in the caption.
There will be a link below this podcast.
And there's the first single's out the 7th of February. I think the first album release will probably be late summer. There's a project I'm working on that we're going to do through the distribution. And then like the podcast, I'm aiming to start the first week of February, which I think I'm going to stick to. And I hope that similarly to when we were talking about curation earlier, like the thing that you do with this podcast is you really choose the guests and the topics. And like, I've actually taken a fair bit of inspiration from what you've been doing here to really think about what I'm doing. And I think that there's something in amongst all of the curatorial skills that if I'm excited about something, I need to figure out how I made that interesting to people. And if I can't, then it's not going to go in until I can. And I think that's the sorts of challenge to set myself around like ChatGPT. Like, how do you really talk about that in a way that Ezra Klein's amazing episode of his podcast and that he does with the New York Times with like the founder of it, which asks all these massive ethical questions and talks about law, and like, I can't do that. And also it's been done so well that I'd rather point people to it than try and, but from the music industry point of view, it's like I made my label copy using it. I couldn't remember what went in a template for label copy because I hadn't done one for like 10 years. And anyone that works in the record label side of things knows what it is. It's kind of all your information about the track. And it was like, which bits do I need to put in? And it made me a template. And then I asked it, what other things could I include? I asked it, why would I include this thing? And it went away and found me an answer. And I actually played around with it to try and write a contract. And
ChatGPT is great for writing really generic press releases, I've found through my experiments. And I find that kind of gratifying, but also not gratifying at the same time, to think that you can just, it can grind out stuff.
One artist I spoke to asked it to write a bio, and it just started making up song titles. So she's now like, it's such an on the nose song title, I'm now going to write a song called that.
Well, kind of with that in mind then, my final question is, if you could pick a favorite piece of music, one that you could only keep one, what would it be and why?
Ooh. For what context? Just for me?
Just for you.
Just for me.
This is for our context around you.
This is quite a big question. I'm now thinking probably, and I now realize I don't actually know how to pronounce it because I don't think I've ever said it out loud. But either Wawaza or The Wailing Wall off side 2 of Low by David Bowie. Is that how you pronounce it? It's how you pronounce Warsaw in Russian, isn't it?
Something like that. Yeah, I don't know, but I know exactly the song.
If I mumble it enough,
side 2. Yeah.
If I mumble it enough, I might get away with it. But that was apparently when I was quite young, the record I would ask for in the car.
Really?
Because it was quite calming, and my mum had a VW Beetle which was quite loud, and so we'd have to drive. She was a hairdresser, so we often used to drive to go get like her hair products and things. And the Beatles are really loud, so I'd often ask for this quite calming piece of music to be put on.
Right.
And then
you could have
having
a word with my daughter then, who's repeatedly requesting Elmo's Christmas album in the end of January.
It's no Baby Shark, I'll put it that way. But
no, she hasn't discovered that yet, thank God. So.
But I think there's something in the fact that one of the biggest artists of all time, known for his big pop songs, also at a time when punk was kicking off, made those beautiful kind of ambient pieces. And that to me is something really special about the duality of music.
That's a perfect example. That it's a brilliant album, Low, and it's split in 2 halves. You've got a pop side and an incredible ambience.
So I went against all of my impulses to pick something brand new, and went for a classic.
I appreciate that, and but a great choice. I think you're the first person to pick David Bowie, by the way, of the people I've asked.
Oh, okay. Because my head was screaming Janelle Monáe, and I couldn't think which song. So yeah.
Well, wherever you are abandoned with that one song, you're going to be super chill. That's probably a good thing if you've only got one. Sean Adams, thank you very much.
Joe, thank you very much.
And there we go. So if you found that useful, please share this podcast on with someone else who you think will also get something out of it. And if you'd like to email me and give me your thoughts, it's joe@musically.com. That's joe@musically.com. Don't forget, we have a free weekly email called The Knowledge, which rounds up a bit of this and a bit of that, of the best analysis, news, marketing, insight, and skills from Music Ally. There's a link below the podcast, so sign up and impress your boss. And don't forget as well, you can check out to see if you are eligible for a free Music Ally subscription. That link is also beneath the podcast. So that's it from me, Joe Sparrow. Until next time, farewell.